Well, we come to a time of the year when many people are focused on Christ and also on spending an awful lot of time with their families. And Brother Britton did a good job this morning speaking on Christ. So this evening we're going to focus a little bit on protecting our marriages and our homes. And I think the majority of us have an understanding that in today's environment, when we go back and we begin to look at the marriage and the home, we have this understanding that there are almost always going to be problems. I think it results oftentimes to the very fact that we have to deal with people or individuals, and we have to deal with different personalities. Combined with that is the fact that we are constantly clashing with society as it regards to our homes and to our marriages, and oftentimes even the physical needs of the home. And so as you begin to talk about a number of these factors, really it boils down to how it is that we handle these things and whether or not our homes and whether our marriages are going to remain faithful. And so I want to spend a few minutes today talking about some common causes to issues in marriages and our homes, and then we'll look at dealing with the problems. Let's start off with one of the most important. Now you'll notice I didn't use lots of verses, but that's because we're going to look at a lot of points and look at them somewhat quickly. I think most of us have the understanding that poor communication is probably one of the biggest sources of problems. And that usually results in the fact that oftentimes we have a misunderstanding of one another's needs. Now we're going to talk about marriages in the home, but of course the home is established with the marriage. And I think oftentimes when we get married, we enter into this relationship with a whole lot of expectations and assumptions that our spouse is going to think and act just like us. Now, for the majority of you who have been married, you know that if you spend a little bit of time thinking back about how things have taken place as you've gotten married, we think a whole lot different. Men don't think like women. Women don't think like men. And as a matter of fact, we expect different things or we have different needs in our marriages. And yet oftentimes the issue is this: we don't communicate well to our spouse what it is that we actually desire or what it is that we actually want. And because we don't do a good job communicating these things, and we oftentimes focus on what it is that we want, what it is that we feel we need, we oftentimes don't give in a reciprocal type manner. Listen to Philippians 2:3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Now, if both of us as spouses do this, I think what we'll find is that we'll have great marriages. But, again, we go back to the fact that for a marriage to thrive, there has to be honest communication so that each of us as spouses knows what the other spouse needs or desires. And again, this isn't an area where we fall short. How many of you guys actually think you spoke the same language as your wife when you got married, or vice versa, the wife and the husband, right? I've learned real quick, and I'm still learning, that what I thought would be important to my wife actually is not, and what is important I haven't totally learned how to maybe fulfill. So a number of us fall into that category. But what we need to do is have good communication, be honest, even in those things that maybe we don't want to talk about or are embarrassed to talk about, because if we can do that, then both of us can make it a priority to fulfill that need. And that ought to be, again, our mindset, to go back and to esteem the other better than ourselves as we try to fulfill those needs and desires. One of the second biggest ones probably would be financial matters. I think this is, and if you look at statistics, you'll find this is one of the primary causes of issues in marriage. Oftentimes it's brought on by materialism. Sometimes it's brought on by selfishness by one or by both of them. Sometimes it even includes poor financial decision making. Many of us, and I'll admit to this, when I was young, I did not make good decisions with money, right? How many of you got your first credit card as soon as you turned 18 and you had to buy that brand new receiver for us guys that you really didn't need, right? Or the best speakers for your car. Well, sometimes we're still doing that stuff when we get married because a lot of us haven't fully matured. When we begin to place money in the forefront of our lives, we understand that God is going to be sidelined. And certainly that happens. Jesus gave us a little bit of a warning. Most of you are familiar with the passage in Matthew 6:24. He said, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." There's a whole lot of marriages today who are suffering either because of one of the spouses or both of them desiring and seeking after money. And oftentimes, and I'll admit I was guilty of this many years ago and maybe still today, oftentimes many of us will give a severe preference to the responsibilities of our job, not even trying to do wrong, but we're so dedicated on what it is that we do that we begin to neglect those that we love. Sometimes it is based on money, other times it's simply because we're so wrapped up in our work. But we have this understanding that a number of homes are suffering because of financial matters or because of those who are seeking after jobs or job promotions or the money that comes along with them. But we know that strong homes are those that are not divided due to money or due to the pursuit of money. And most of us know somebody who has had a marriage or a home destroyed by that. Another issue that we often find plaguing homes and marriages is worldliness. We could actually preach a sermon on every one of these, but we're going to look at just some short basic understandings. Worldliness is oftentimes maybe hand in hand with financial matters, but it includes a whole lot more. When you begin to talk about this idea of worldliness, it includes things like materialism. It includes how it is that we utilize our time, the things and the people that we're involved in, where our ambitions are. That would go back again oftentimes to things that lead into financial issues or job-related problems, and even who it is that we let influence the decisions we make. How many of you know somebody who is a Christian but is unequally yoked to somebody out in the world? A number of us know people that are like that. And the danger of it is really all of us are susceptible. We were warned of this in 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. I think a number of Christians, and most of us know and would agree, have become unfaithful because of things out in the world. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you look at James 4:4, we find there, and he doesn't use tame language to describe them. James 4:4, he says, Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God, and whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. An awful lot of homes and marriages have been destroyed by the world and the things in the world. The world, let's face it, has a number of things that are desirous. They're not all bad, and yet at the same point we have to understand that many of these will cause issues in the family and the home. And again, it's usually due to a loss on spiritual matters. Now let's talk about improper attitudes here for a second. We've already touched on some of the improper attitudes. There's a number of them that cause issues in the home, also would cause issues specifically in the marriage. And the truth is we could go through a list and again dedicate an entire sermon. We could talk about issues such as selfishness. Oftentimes when you find a marriage problem, it boils down to one of them or both of the spouses being selfish. Sometimes we have attitudes of hatefulness. Sometimes it's attitudes of pride that we allow to influence the home and the marriage. Sometimes it's indifference or laziness. I think I preached on that not too long ago. Sometimes there are attitudes of jealousy. Maybe it's anger. Sometimes there's dishonesty. We could list a lot more. But all of these attitudes that we've listed, all of them are harmful to any relationship, whether it's a family relationship, whether it's sister to sister, sister to brother, or whether it's a relationship in the family with the spouses. I'm going to use an unusual verse as we talk about these improper attitudes. Consider Ephesians 4:29, and I think you'll understand why I pick it here in a minute. It says, Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. As Christians, we're supposed to avoid all of these different attitudes that cause issues. And oftentimes, these different attitudes that we have, they actually become very evident in the words that we use. You can tell very quickly if somebody is selfish or hateful or prideful or arrogant or whatever it might be in their communication. Specifically, we're not to have any corrupt communication. But ultimately, this is often the cause of issues in the marriage and the home. Just simply put down improper attitudes. Let me talk about another one here. And I think these two go together. Some people probably would break these down into separate points. I wouldn't. Oftentimes, getting into a rut and marital infidelity go together. And I think oftentimes the reason is because when life seems to be in a rut and the relationship seems to really become boring, there are a number of dangers that begin to insert themselves into the marriage. I think many of you, if you think back, and if you will, think back to all of the times in your marriage when you've had arguments, or even maybe when you were younger, maybe even today, I think most of us would admit we still fall short of this. Oftentimes we take our spouse or our family for granted. I think most of you would agree to that, wouldn't you? I know that I do. And that's why when you have an argument, you'll use oftentimes words that you wouldn't use to a complete stranger. I think the idea is because they're family, they're close, and they really, you're in your mindset, they have to forgive you, right? And so oftentimes we do. We take advantage of our family members and our loved ones. And oftentimes when this happens, it begins to gradually erode away, either at the base of the home and the relationships in the home, and oftentimes even within the marriage itself. Now, as I began to think a little bit about this, and I almost always approach it this way, I think most of us understand that whenever you find a leader who is lacking, it affects whatever it is that he's leading. If you look at a Fortune 500 company, when they begin to have a leader that is showing signs or of lacking in leadership skills, or he's not doing an adequate job, you know what they do real quick, right? They replace the leader. And I began to think about leadership because a leader knows, and he goes, and he shows the way. And so as I began to think about marriage and I began to think about home, I don't think you can start anywhere else other than the husband. If there's a problem in the marriage, now not always, but oftentimes the problem can simply be by looking at the husband. If you go back and look at Ephesians 5:25, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." That's the kind of love that a wife wants. And when a wife gets that type of a love, it causes the marriage to be in a correct aspect. When a husband loves like this, both the husband and the wife, I think, find both their needs met in the marriage, whether it's physical or emotional. Now, when we begin to look at the reasons for adultery and divorce and discontentment, it always begins due to one of the spouses being unhappy. Now, I went back and I began to look up a little bit of information. I already thought I had it accurately down, but I wanted to double check it. Let me give you just some basic facts on adultery. And I think many of you have probably read these facts before. But let's look at women first who have somehow succumbed to an affair or adultery. When they've talked and done statistics, they've found that women primarily do not become unfaithful to their husbands or get involved in an affair simply because of the physical act of intimacy. In almost every instance, what happens is the wife is actually looking to replace the emotional aspect that she's not getting at home. And I think most of us know that that's exactly what's going on. Oftentimes it's like this. She works in an environment possibly or has come into contact with somebody. A gentleman begins to give her attention that the husband's not giving to her. She begins to feel desired because they have some type of an emotional connection, and that's usually what leads into it. Men are completely different. When you look at the statistics, it oftentimes has nothing to do with appearance, and it oftentimes doesn't have anything to do with emotion. Men are usually either unfaithful to try to replace either a lacking physical relationship, or for whatever reason they're trying to get away from their spouse and their responsibilities at home. That's oftentimes, according to statistics, what's taking place, and why men and women begin to either get involved in an affair or something of that nature. Furthermore, I found this interesting. According to the majority of statistics, most wives and husbands, when they've been caught being unfaithful, they don't actually want a divorce. The reason that they were involved in this is because it's a sinful reaction to the fact that either they or their spouse have a problem in the marriage. Oftentimes it's just their personal issue. But most of them don't want to have a divorce. Now, that's not to say that one is not authorized or even necessary because of their actions, but that's not usually the case. They're not looking for a divorce. And so when we talk about getting into a rut and we talk about marital infidelity, oftentimes they are tied together. Sometimes both individuals have a part in it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just the one. But as we think about getting into a rut, we can help prevent some of this by constantly checking ourselves and questioning our spouse when we see questionable or unusual behavior in the marriage and the home. And that's because it's a whole lot easier to deal with discontentment now than it is to deal with an affair later, okay? And for those that have children in the home, we have this understanding that the marriage needs have to come before the children to keep everything else in a proper working order. I'm going to talk a little bit about this here in a few minutes when we talk about dealing with problems. So let's deal with some of the problems we've talked with here. Each of the problems that we've talked with here does have its own unique set of solutions or solution in general. And they are all addressed in the Bible if we go back and we begin to look. And so if we want our homes to be spiritually strong, then we need to consider some of these. The very first and the foremost, I think, simply is this. Because if a marriage is doing this one right here, virtually almost all the other ones are going to go away. Now I'm talking here about both individuals. But as we look at a marriage, if both individuals are seeking after the will of God, a number of the problems that we see in the home and in the marriage, they'll go away. Matthew 6:33 says this, and I'm going to focus on the very first portion of the verse. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Go back to the very first portion of the verse. Certainly in our marriages and in our homes, this is what we need to be doing, right? We need to be seeking after the will of God. Now, many of the problems that we face, again, in our homes and in our marriages, they result simply in this: God's not being put first. I cannot think, how many of you know of a couple who both were doing as well as they could and following the Bible and praying and striving, and they ended up getting divorced when both couples were doing that? I don't think you're going to find it anywhere. And so this is what it boils down to oftentimes. I think that when you consider what we were talking about a second ago, adultery or affairs, those things never happen when a spouse is constantly on guard to these types of threat. Furthermore, a spouse wouldn't even consider any of these things when their needs are being met at home and both spouses are walking in unison spiritually. When that takes place, most of these things go away. Now let me address the unmarried individuals for a second. They have a lot of similar problems. Many of the unmarried individuals, they're out in the world oftentimes. They're dealing with a number of issues as it is, sometimes dating and things like that, and they have to be on guard again against lust and the sins that are associated with it, because they're constantly reminded of all of the requirements that are placed upon a Christian. Now, it's interesting in today's environment that we live in, when you begin to talk about what the Bible teaches about marriage, or even about those who are not yet married and purity, oftentimes you've got this mindset of, you guys as Christians are a whole bunch of prudes, right? You're trying to take away the fun out of it. Matter of fact, when you go back and you begin to talk about the intimate relationship between a man and a woman, I think Christians are the complete opposite. Christians ought to have the best physically intimate relationships that we have, and yet we have an understanding that the confines are, as great as those things are, they're only allowed in marriage, right? The only difference between us and the society around us is they want those things prior to being married. We agree that those things are wonderful, but can only take place in the confines of marriage. And so as we begin to talk about the home and marriage, we have to remember this: God instituted the home and marriage. He knows what's best for the home and for the marriage. And so we need to seek after, again, God's will in all these things. And you go back to Ephesians 5:15 through 17. It's a verse I use quite often. See then that ye walk circumspectly, that idea of being careful, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. If we understand that last part, understanding the will of the Lord in every aspect, whether it is that we're not yet married or whether it is that we are married and we have a family, if we know what the will of the Lord is and we're seeking after the will of God, that's going to eliminate the majority of problems that we have to deal with. Now, let's talk about addressing problems. Many marriages, they struggle because let's just say it. We take a lot of our problems and we begin to sweep them up under the rug, right? It's kind of the idea of it's bad and I don't want to deal with it because it leads to arguments and it leads to other issues. But if we don't face these issues, they're just going to get worse. And in the case of family and marital problems, failing to address a number of these physical issues, whether it would be things like finances, whether it would be things like communication, whether it would be intimacy in the relationship, all of those things result in frustration. That leads to resentment, and that's finally exhibited oftentimes in unhealthy attitudes and words. Now, let me say this just for a second for the husbands and the wives. For many, sweeping issues under the rug eventually causes one of us to trip on the obstacles that we ourselves have created. I don't think most people think about that. Have you ever seen anybody try to, if you came into my house and I didn't expect you and I wanted to hide something, let's say I had something in my house and I slid it under the rug and it was about this tall, what would eventually happen as I tried to walk across that rug, right? I would eventually trip over it. We're doing that oftentimes in our marriages. We sweep things under the rug. They begin to pile up. They get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually we've created an obstacle that we're going to trip over. And you guys know that it's true. Let's boil it down to a very simple fact. This always happens. I'm not saying it happens often, but it always happens at least at some time in a marriage. We get mad because we have an argument. When we have an argument and we get mad, what do? Well, we either withhold ourselves physically or we withhold ourselves emotionally from our spouse. That causes further aggravation, and we begin to drive a wedge into the marriage. And when that happens, eventually there's going to be some severe damage done. 1 Corinthians 5:6 warns us, we used this verse this morning, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now, while that's especially addressing the church there, it's also true of our marriages and our lives. Let's talk about honestly evaluating ourselves. I think if we really want to resolve problems, we have to start looking at ourselves. I think in most marriages, I don't think that the majority of problems happen just from one person. Now, sometimes they do. I have to always put that exclusion in there. But sometimes it's the result of both. 2 Corinthians 13:5 says this, "Examine yourselves whether ye be in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know ye not your own selves, how that Jesus Christ is in you, except ye be reprobates." Now, again, few problems are caused simply by one. Now, again, there is the exception. But oftentimes, both are involved. And even if one spouse is guilty of something, sometimes it's good for us to go back and to ask ourselves, did my behavior in any way contribute to it? Now, it may not have. It may or it may not have. But we need to ask the questions. Did my failure to fulfill my responsibilities in my role as a father, as a wife, as a parent, whatever it might be, did those contribute to the problem? Now, again, don't misunderstand me. Let me say this. I'm not saying that we are responsible for another person's actions. Let me say that, because there are times when one spouse or one parent is striving as hard as they can, and they are trying to be in alignment with God's Word, and you will have a spouse or a parent who simply is not walking in unison. And that oftentimes does happen. But with that being said, let's understand this. No issue ever in a marriage gives another the right to sin, right? But sometimes the issues are caused by both. And so we need to go back simply and examine the things that have taken place and ask ourselves, did I have some type of a role in this? Was it possibly due to unkind attitudes? Was it possibly due to the way I handle money? Or was it something related to the fact that I wasn't present in my role as a father, as a mother, as a parent, whatever it might be? That's a very general requirement, but it's something we need to go back and often do. We need to honestly evaluate ourselves. Then after that, we need to be accountable. I think the majority of us as husbands and wives, when we go back and we honestly evaluate ourselves, we find there are a number of areas we could improve in. I'm not suggesting we're totally falling short, but there are areas we could improve in. And so when we realize that, we need to be accountable, and we need to accept the consequences for our actions. Let me pause for a second. Sometimes the consequences for our actions are simply that we would repent of the issue and we strive to do better. Sometimes it's a very serious consequence, such as a consequence maybe for one who committed adultery. And so when we have to be accountable for those actions, that's something we need to think of. I know a gentleman, I won't tell you his name, I may have mentioned it before, but he was a gospel preacher and he was unfaithful to his wife. And I don't know all of the details in it, but part of the consequence of that is she divorced him. She put him away. Interestingly, I did get a little bit of a message from him trying to see if I had heard that they were no longer together. And he simply said, yeah, I was unfaithful to her, and we were divorced. And he said, so now I'm simply doing the best that I can to live as a faithful Christian. I think that's hard to put on anybody, but yet he understood he had to be accountable. And so we need to be accountable here on earth, not only to our family members, our children, and to our spouse, but we need to be accountable in all of those things so that we can have pure marriages, so that we can have pure homes. And the reason is because as accountable as we are to our spouses and to our children, we're even more accountable to our Heavenly Father. Romans 14:12 says, "So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God." As important as it is to have a pure home, we need to be pure individually when we pass from this life so we can stand before the Father with confidence. Go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13. I'm going to talk for just a second about thinking no evil. And we're going to talk about looking for the good in our spouse and for those that are in our home. I'm going to go down to 1 Corinthians 13, 5 and 6. And we're talking here about charity. Charity there really is the rendering for love. 1 Corinthians 13, 5, I'm going to insert the word here, love. Love, or charity, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. As Christians, we have to always assume the best of our spouse rather than the worst. And when I say that, I have to say this also. Yet at the same time, as Christians and wanting our spouse to also make it to heaven with us, we can't be naive. What I mean is we can't just bury our head in the sand. Let me give you an example here. If I were to be sitting in the house, and I'm just going to let me not use an example of me. Let me just make up a name, because I don't want my wife to say, you shouldn't have said that. Let's say we know a guy by the name of Cliff. I don't know anybody by the name of Cliff. Cliff's sitting in his house. His wife's supposed to come home at 7 o'clock, and his wife isn't there at 7 o'clock. She's not there at 8 o'clock, and she strolls in about 8:30. Now, Cliff's first assumption shouldn't be that his wife is out being unfaithful to him. That shouldn't be her first assumption or his first assumption. But if his wife is gone all the time from 7 to 8:30, and he can never seem to figure out where it is that she might be, Cliff probably ought to be asking some questions, right? Because here's the thing. He ought to be concerned. There could be a very logical reason for this. Could be that she is dealing with another Christian who is struggling with something, and she's trying to help them, and she was trying to do it somewhat confidentially. And so there may be a very logical reason as to why she has unaccounted time and why she's not been telling him specifically where it is that she's been going. And yet at the same time, there's another possibility. You guys know what the other possibility is? She might be involved in something that she ought not to be involved in. With that being said, let me say this. A faithful spouse wouldn't be defensive if asked where they were. If I were not to come home, let's say, at a certain time, and even if that became a regular pattern and I hadn't talked about it, if my wife were to come and ask me where it is that you've been, I wouldn't get defensive about it, right? I better have a pretty good reason for it. And so when I say we always give them the benefit of the doubt, I'm saying at the same time we can't be naive, okay? We ought to be able to ask those questions. And again, let's go back to it. It's much easier to deal with discontentment or some type of a sin issue now that's really, as we would call, maybe a smaller problem than it is to start to deal with an adultery issue later. Let's talk about being patient in the marriage. Go ahead and go down one more verse to 1 Corinthians 13:7. We're talking about charity or love. It beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. I want to focus on bearing all things. We're talking about enduring patiently. It's hard, I think, oftentimes for us to remember that marriage is a marathon and it's not a sprint. Oftentimes when we think about marriage, we're thinking simply about the here and now, the desires that I want or the wants that I have or the needs that I have. And we seem to forget that marriage is going to go through an awful lot of different stages which affect both the marriage relationship and the family. Now, for those of you who are married, I want you to think back for just a second and remember when you got married and you didn't have any children. You could do whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. In essence, I would break it down to this. You had freedom and romance and nobody was bothering you, right? Well, it doesn't take very long because after the first child, what you have oftentimes is a wife who's trying to get 10 minutes either to get a shower or to go to the bathroom, right? And then you have the second, the third, and the fourth child, and the husband comes home and he can't wait for the children to get to bed only to tuck them in and to come back and find out that his wife's already asleep also. For those of you who are married, you know it's true. Why do I bring that up? Well, we have to realize that oftentimes the issues that we deal with in the family aren't issues that start just overnight. There are oftentimes issues that we know are going to begin to develop. And sometimes it takes a little time for these issues to work themselves out, specifically for our children, about 22 years, maybe 30, maybe 40, right? But I say all of that because it's not always going to be this way. John, you have quite a few kids like me. It's not always going to be the case when I have to make sure that they're in bed, or for the older ones, making sure that they're home at an appropriate time. Eventually, there's going to come a time where it'll be back to how it was when I first got married, where I don't per se have children in the house to worry about and all the things that goes along with it. And so we have to remember we have to suffer long and endure through a number of these issues. I'm not saying kids aren't enjoyable and great. I'm saying that as great as children are, they also begin to cause issues in the marriage bond. And so we have to remember that. Let's talk for a second about fighting fair, and then I'll start to draw to a close here. This is another issue in marriages, not just in marriages, but also in the home. There are a number of rules we have to remember when we're fighting. And I'm going to tell you guys, I know what the Bible says about it. I'm just not saying I'm the best at it yet. I'm still working on a number of these things. Many of these things we don't learn until we're married. Sometimes they're not modeled well for us. Things that we need to think about during discussions or as we're having arguments. We have to learn to give respect and love. At the same time, limiting accusations and conversations to whatever it is that the issue is at hand. And what I mean is not veering off into other topics. Knowing what boundaries there are that we don't cross. And that's going to vary from person to person and from families. Also understanding that there's a time for cooling off. And also understanding that at the same time we have to be desirous of forgiving. Sometimes spouses get hysterical during a discussion or an argument. And sometimes they get historical. What I mean is this. We talked about it a little bit this morning. Sometimes spouses get hysterical. They become very illogical. When I say that, sometimes it's probably me. We become very illogical about certain things that we're arguing about. Sometimes they don't get hysterical, they get historical, and we talked about that this morning. They begin to go back and bring things up from the past. Like, I remember that time when most of us, we've all probably done it. And so those are things that we have to remember. It's not good to become hysterical, neither is it good to become historical. As a matter of fact, Proverbs 15:18 says this, "A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife." I think many of us are still trying to master Proverbs 15:18. But here's the thing. The ideal home is a home where everybody is focused on God. Everybody is focused on that will that's been recorded for us in the Scriptures. It motivates us to try to live in alignment with it. And with that, we hope to better our marriages and our home, knowing that sometimes problems are simply going to arise. Sometimes it boils down, again, as we look back to a number of these issues, to poor communication, to financial matters, worldliness trying to insert itself into our marriages and our homes, improper attitudes. Sometimes it's because we feel like we're going through the rut, or we have it appears at the time, stagnant marriage. There's a whole host of problems. But with that being said, we understand there are times where we will fail, where we'll fall short. And yet at the same time, we also understand that we can resolve all these issues, and we can continue to focus on and try to build stronger homes and marriages. And certainly all of this is going to begin when one becomes a Christian. I won't spend much time on it. The Bible is very clear about how that takes place. We understand people were teaching the gospel, the death, burial, and the resurrection of Christ, focused on the fact that Jesus himself died to establish the church, the one church, Matthew 16, 18, and 19. We were then told to go out and to preach that, Matthew 28, 19, and 20, in the Great Commission. And when people have heard that preaching and they believe, John 8, 24, and they're willing to repent of their sins, Luke 13, 3 and 5, Acts 17, 30, they're willing to confess Christ, Matthew 10, 32 and 33, and Romans 10, 9 and 10, and they're willing to be immersed in water for the remission of their sins, Mark 16, 16. They can be added to the church by the Lord himself. And certainly, I think for each of us, that's what we want in our families. We want Christ-centered families and marriages. Now, as I draw this to a close, if there's anybody here that needs the prayers of the congregation, you realize there's an area you've fallen short in, we'd love to pray for you. If there's another area that we might be able to assist you in, you can simply come forward as we stand and we sing a song of invitation.